They called Daniel Remington the Untouchable, a Wall Street titan who bought judges like stocks and crushed whistleblowers like insects. His $2.3 billion empire seemed invincible, built on the broken dreams of thousands. In 30 years, no one had even come close to bringing him down, until Judge Alexandria Washington walked into Courtroom 318. He laughed when he saw her. A black female judge? He'd destroyed better men with a single phone call. But as his empire crumbles and his allies flee, Daniel's about to learn what real power looks like. Because Judge Washington doesn't need money or threats. She has something far more dangerous, pure, unshakable justice. And she's coming for his crown. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Crystal glasses clinked against each other as Manhattan's elite gathered in Daniel Remington's 3-story penthouse overlooking Central Park. The evening sky painted the luxurious apartment in deep purples and oranges, reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows. Daniel stood at the center of his grand living room, holding court like a king among his subjects. "To early retirement," he announced, raising his glass of 30-year-old scotch. The crowd of executives and socialites chuckled, understanding the cruel joke behind his words. Just that morning, Remington Corp had executed its most aggressive hostile takeover yet, leaving thousands of employees jobless. Daniel's steel-gray hair caught the light as he turned to address specific members of his audience. At 52, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never faced real consequences. His custom Tom Ford suit probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Jennifer," he called out to his CFO, who stood nervously by one of the abstract paintings that probably cost more than most houses. "Tell everyone how smoothly the transition went." Jennifer Mitchell smoothed her blazer, clearly uncomfortable. "The merger was efficient, Mr. Remington." "Efficient?" Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It was brilliant. 3,000 redundant positions eliminated. The shareholders will be thrilled." He turned to the crowd. "Sometimes you have to trim the fat to stay lean and competitive." As conversations resumed around him, Daniel noticed his head of legal affairs, Richard Palmer, hovering at the edge of the party. The old lawyer's face carried the kind of worry lines Daniel had come to hate. "Richard, you're killing the mood. Come have a drink." "We need to talk, Daniel. Privately." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his smile remained fixed. "Use my office. Down the hall, past the Picasso." The two men walked through the opulent apartment, their shoes clicking against marble floors. Daniel's office was a testament to power, walls lined with awards and photos of him shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. He closed the heavy wooden door behind them. "Make it quick, Richard. I have guests." "The FBI is looking into the pension fund allocations," Daniel laughed, pouring himself another drink. "They're always looking into something. Handle it." "This is different. Someone talked. They have documentation about the offshore accounts." "Someone talked?" Daniel's voice dropped dangerously low. "Who?" "We don't know yet, but—" "Then find out." The crystal glass in Daniel's hand shattered, sending scotch and blood running down his fingers. He barely noticed. "I pay you ridiculous amounts of money to prevent these situations." "Daniel, listen. To me, this is serious. They're building a case. I don't want to hear about problems, Richard. I want solutions. That's why you make 7 figures." Daniel grabbed a handkerchief, wrapping it around his bleeding hand. "Now get out there and fix it." As Richard left, Daniel's phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer. "Emergency meeting needed. SEC flagged irregular transactions." Daniel's fingers tightened around the phone. Women, always panicking over nothing. He'd given Jennifer the CFO position to shut up the diversity advocates on his board, but lately, she'd become a liability with her constant concerns about his creative accounting. In the corner of his office, hidden behind a potted plant, a small red light blinked on a disguised recording device. Marcus Reynolds, a junior executive who'd been passed over for promotion 3 times due to what Daniel called lack of the right background, had planted it there weeks ago. The party continued late into the night. As guests gradually departed, Daniel remained in his office, making calls to various contacts, judges he'd helped appoint, politicians he'd funded, regulators he'd bribed. By dawn, his confidence had returned. No one would dare touch him. He'd built his empire through careful cultivation of power and influence. Around 9 a.m., his phone rang again. Jennifer. What? They're here. Her voice shook. The FBI. They're seizing servers. Daniel ended the call, standing up so quickly his chair slammed into the wall. Through his office windows, he could see dark vehicles surrounding the Remington Tower across the street. Men in FBI jackets streamed into the building. Impossible, he muttered, but his hands shook as he dialed Richard. The lawyer's voice was grim. Don't say anything. Don't delete anything. I'm on my way. Daniel ignored him, immediately beginning to shred documents. His secretary buzzed through on the intercom. Mr. Remington, there are federal agents here with a warrant. Tell them I'm unavailable. Sir, they're already on their way up. Daniel looked at the half-shredded papers on his desk, at his computer full of incriminating emails. For the first time in decades, real fear crept into his chest. The office door burst open. FBI agents flooded in, weapons drawn. Daniel Remington, please step away from the desk. Do you know who I am? Daniel's voice rose. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Sir, step away from the desk now. As they led him out in handcuffs, employees he'd terrorized for years watched with barely concealed satisfaction. Jennifer stood by her office, tears running down her face. Daniel snarled at her. You did this, didn't you? You stupid bit. Mr. Remington, one of the agents cut him off. You have the right to remain silent. The next few days passed in a blur of interrogations and legal meetings. Richard brought in a team of high-powered attorneys, but something was different. People weren't bowing to pressure. The usual tactics weren't working. Then came the news that made Daniel's blood run cold. Judge Alexandria Washington would be presiding over his case. No. Daniel paced his penthouse, now under surveillance. No, get her removed. On what grounds? Richard asked tiredly. Any grounds. She's biased against successful white men. She's part of the whole diversity conspiracy. She probably got her position through affirmative action anyway. Judge Washington graduated top of her class at Harvard Law. She was editor of the Law Review. She has a spotless record. I don't care if she's fucking Solomon. Daniel hurled a paperweight at the wall. I won't have some black woman deciding my fate. Fix it. Richard stood up slowly, gathering his briefcase. I can't work with you anymore. Daniel, what? You need help. Real help. And I won't be part of your self-destruction. The veteran lawyer walked to the door. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it's ending this way. You can't quit. I made you. Goodbye, Daniel. Alone in his penthouse, Daniel made more calls. Fewer people answered than before. Those who did seemed hesitant, distant. His usual fixers quoted astronomical prices or claimed they were too busy. A week later, Bradley Thompson arrived, young, hungry, with a reputation for aggressive defense tactics. He listened to Daniel rant about Judge Washington with an eager smile. Don't worry, Mr. Remington, we'll put her in her place. Daniel liked that phrase. Put her in her place. Yes, that's exactly what they would do. The initial hearing approached. Daniel's empire began showing cracks. The SEC froze several accounts. Major clients jumped ship. The stock price plummeted. None of that mattered to Daniel. He became obsessed with Judge Washington, demanding his team dig up dirt on her. Every report showed the same thing. Brilliant legal mind, unimpeachable ethics, respected by peers. Everyone has secrets, Daniel insisted. Everyone can be bought. Find her price. The morning of the hearing, Daniel dressed in his finest suit. He practiced his most charming smile in the mirror. He'd handled judges before. This would be no different. But as he walked into the courthouse, something felt wrong. The reporters didn't seem intimidated by him. The court officers didn't treat him with deference. And when Judge Alexandria Washington entered the courtroom, her presence commanded instant respect. All rise, the bailiff called out. Daniel remained seated, smirking. Judge Washington's dark eyes found him. She didn't seem angry or flustered. She simply waited, radiating quiet authority. "Mr. Remington," she said calmly, "in my courtroom, everyone stands, even you." Her voice carried no anger, no emotion at all, just absolute certainty that she would be obeyed. Daniel's smirk faltered. Slowly, reluctantly, he stood. "Thank you," she said, as if his defiance meant nothing to her. "Now let's begin." The hearing lasted 3 hours. Every motion Bradley Thompson filed was systematically dismantled. Every attempt to delay was countered. Judge Washington's logic was flawless, her knowledge of precedent extraordinary. By the end, Daniel's confidence had cracked. This wasn't going according to plan. This woman wasn't playing by his rules. "Your Honor," Bradley tried one last time, "given Mr. Remington's standing in the community—" "Mr. Thompson," Judge Washington interrupted, "your client's standing is precisely what's at issue here. The evidence suggests Mr. Remington used that standing to perpetrate a massive fraud that destroyed thousands of lives." She turned her gaze to Daniel. "Bail is set at $50 million. Surrender your passport. You will wear an ankle monitor. Any attempt to contact witnesses or jurors will result in immediate remand." "This is outrageous," Daniel exploded. "You can't." "I can and I have." She didn't raise her voice at all. "We reconvene in 2 weeks. Court is adjourned." As Daniel was let out, he heard whispers from the gallery, saw phones recording his walk of shame. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and a black woman he couldn't bribe or bully was holding the hammer. "This isn't over," he muttered, watching Judge Washington gather her papers. "This is just beginning." That evening, alone in his penthouse, Daniel made one final call. A man whose services he'd never dared use before. The kind of man you couldn't find through normal channels. "I need everything on Judge Washington," he said into the phone. "Everything. No limits, no restrictions, whatever it costs." The voice on the other end was cold. "Consider it done." Daniel hung up, staring out at the Manhattan skyline that had been his kingdom. Soon, he promised himself, he'd have Judge Washington begging for mercy. Soon she'd learn what happened to people who tried to take what was his. But in the back of his mind, a new feeling gnawed at him. For the first time in his adult life, Daniel Remington felt afraid. Morning sunlight streamed through the high windows of Courtroom 318, illuminating dust motes in the air. The gallery was packed, reporters and spectators buzzing with anticipation. 10 minutes after the scheduled start time, Daniel Remington strolled in as if he owned the building, deliberately checking his phone. Bradley Thompson whispered urgently, "Mr. Remington, please, we discussed this." "Shut up," Daniel muttered, thumbs dancing across his screen. When the bailiff called for all to rise, he remained seated, eyes fixed on his phone. The room fell silent as Judge Alexandria Washington entered, her black robes flowing with quiet authority. Her gaze fell on Daniel. "Mr. Remington, in this courtroom, we show respect for the legal process. Please surrender your phone to the bailiff." Daniel looked up, smirking. "I'm in the middle of important business dealings, Your Honor. Unlike some people, I actually contribute to the economy." The gallery tensed. Judge Washington's expression didn't change. "Bailiff, please collect Mr. Remington's phone. Mr. Remington, the next display of contempt will result in sanctions." As the bailiff approached, Daniel stood abruptly. "This is harassment. Just another example of the system targeting successful white businessmen." He tossed the phone carelessly, forcing the bailiff to lunge to catch it. "Happy now, meter maid?" The room gasped. Bradley Thompson's face went pale, but Judge Washington simply made a note on her pad. "Mr. Remington, you are fined $50,000 for contempt. Would you like to go for $100,000? Daniel opened his mouth, but Bradley kicked him under the table. For once, he stayed quiet. "Prosecution may proceed with opening statements," Judge Washington said, as if nothing had happened. Catherine Bennett rose from the prosecution table, her tailored suit and confident stance marking her as someone used to high-stakes courtroom battles. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about trust. Trust given and trust betrayed." As she outlined the government's case, Screens around the courtroom displayed a complex web of offshore accounts and shell companies. The evidence will show that Mr. Remington orchestrated a $2.3 billion fraud. He didn't just steal money, he stole retirements, children's college funds, families' futures. Daniel leaned back, examining his manicured nails. But his pose of boredom slipped when Catherine clicked to the next slide. This email, sent by Mr. Remington to his former CFO, Jennifer Mitchell, explicitly discusses hiding pension fund transfers from regulators. Quote, "These people are too stupid to manage their own money anyway. Better it's in our hands." The jury's expressions hardened. Daniel scribbled a furious note to Bradley, "Destroy her." The morning break found Daniel pacing the courthouse bathroom, his composure cracking. Catherine Bennett entered, stopping short when she saw him. "Wrong bathroom, sweetheart," Daniel sneered, stepping into her personal space. "Though I'm sure sleeping your way to the top has made you comfortable in men's rooms." Catherine didn't back away. "That's an interesting strategy, Mr. Remington. Please keep talking. The jury loves a misogynist." As she turned to leave, Daniel grabbed her arm. "Listen here, you uppity." A security camera in the corner whirred, turning toward them. Catherine smiled coldly. "Please continue. I'd love to add witness intimidation to the charges." Daniel released her, hands shaking with rage. When Bradley came looking for him, he found his client punching the marble wall. "Mr. Remington, we need to discuss strategy. I want her destroyed. Both of them. That self-righteous judge and that bitch prosecutor. Sir, about Judge Washington, every motion we've filed questioning her competency has been denied. The Bar Association is starting to take notice. Then file more motions. That's what I'm paying you for." Back in court, Bradley tried to undermine the prosecution's evidence. Judge Washington methodically struck down each objection, citing precise legal precedents. Her calm efficiency only fueled Daniel's rage. "Your Honor," Bradley attempted, "these offshore transactions were standard business practices." "Mr. Thompson," Judge Washington interrupted, "are you arguing that fraud becomes legal if done on a large enough scale?" The gallery tittered. Daniel's face reddened. "Furthermore," she continued, "your motion to suppress the email evidence is denied. The warrant was properly executed, and Mr. Remington's attempt to shred documents during the FBI raid suggests consciousness of guilt." "This is a witch hunt," Daniel shouted, rising from his chair. Judge Washington's voice cut through his outburst. "Mr. Remington, you will sit down, or you will sit in a cell. Your choice." The afternoon brought a parade of financial experts, each detailing another aspect of Daniel's massive fraud. He watched his carefully constructed schemes being dissected, his financial empire exposed as a house of cards. During the final recess, Bradley pulled Daniel into a conference room. "Sir, we need to discuss a plea deal." Daniel threw a legal pad at his lawyer's head. "Get out." "Mr. Remington, the evidence." "You're fired. I'll represent myself before I watch you fumble this case any further." "Sir, please, get out." The young lawyer gathered his papers, shoulders slumping. At the door, he turned back. "They have everything, Mr. Remington. Every email, every transfer, every threat you made. It's over." Daniel hurled a water pitcher, but Bradley was already gone. Alone in the conference room, Daniel pulled out a burner phone he'd managed to keep hidden. The private investigator answered on the first ring. "Tell me you found something on the judge." "Mr. Remington, we've looked. She's clean, squeaky clean." "Nobody's clean. Dig deeper." "Sir, my fee. Money is no object. Everyone has secrets. Find hers." The day's final session began with Daniel announcing he would represent himself. Judge Washington peered at him over her reading glasses. "Mr. Remington, you understand this is inadvisable? You have no legal training." "I have a Harvard Business School education, Your Honor." He infused the honorific with mockery. "I think I can handle a little courtroom procedure." "Very well. I'm required to warn you that representing yourself often leads to adverse outcomes. Save your maternal instincts for someone else, Your Honor. I don't need advice from—" "You will not interrupt me again, Mr. Remington." Her tone could have frozen fire. "You will comport yourself according to proper courtroom procedure, or you will be removed. Is that clear?" Daniel's hands gripped the table edge. "Crystal clear, Your Honor." As Catherine Bennett called her next, "Witness." Daniel rose slowly. "Your Honor, I'd like to approach the bench." "Proceed." He walked forward, tension radiating from every movement. The bailiff shifted nervously. Before Daniel could reach the bench, Judge Washington held up one hand. "That's close enough, Mr. Remington. But, Your Honor," he said through clenched teeth, "I merely wish to discuss—" "Return to your table, Mr. Remington." "Now." Their eyes locked. The entire courtroom held its breath. Finally, Daniel turned away, but not before everyone saw the mask slip, saw the rage and hatred twisting his features. That evening, news channels played footage of Daniel's courtroom behavior on repeat. Commentary focused on his obvious contempt for women in authority. Social media exploded with clips of his worst moments. In his penthouse, Daniel watched his public image crumbling. His phone rang. The board of directors wanted an emergency meeting. His private banker called about concerning transactions. Even his country club put his membership under review. But Daniel barely noticed. He sat in his darkened office replaying Judge Washington's words in his head, her calm dismissals, her absolute control. She'd humiliated him, and she'd done it, without raising her voice or showing a hint of emotion. On his desk, files from the private investigator contained nothing useful. Judge Washington's record was impeccable. Her personal life was above reproach. She had no skeletons in her closet, no dirty secrets to exploit. Daniel opened his laptop, fingers hovering over the keys. He began typing an email to someone he'd sworn never to contact, someone who dealt in more permanent solutions to problems. A noise made him look up. Through his window, he could see into the courthouse across the street. A single light burned in an office. Judge Washington was still working, reviewing case files with the same meticulous attention she'd shown in court. Daniel closed his laptop. No, an accident or disappearance would be too obvious. He needed to destroy her completely, needed to show the world that no one, especially not some black woman judge, could treat Daniel Remington this way. He pulled out another burner phone, dialing a different number. "It's me. I need you to contact some people on the jury. Make them understand what happens if they make the wrong decision." The voice on the other end hesitated. "That's risky, Mr. Remington. With the scrutiny you're under, I don't pay you to question me. Do it." Daniel hung up and walked to his window. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow he'd remind everyone who really held the power in this city. But as he stared at the light in Judge Washington's office, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally met someone he couldn't intimidate, couldn't bribe, and couldn't break. The thought kept him awake all night. Rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Daniel's Central Park West penthouse, casting shifting shadows across the surveillance photos spread across his mahogany desk. Each image showed Judge Alexandria Washington going about her daily routine, leaving her tastefully modest brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, buying coffee at a local shop, reviewing cases at her favorite cafe near the courthouse. 2 weeks of constant surveillance had yielded nothing but pictures of a dedicated professional doing her job. Daniel's reflection in the rain-streaked window looked haggard. His usually immaculate silver hair stuck up in irregular tufts where he'd been running his fingers through it obsessively. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He hadn't slept properly in days, spending his nights poring over these useless photos, searching for any hint of impropriety. "There has to be something," he muttered, shuffling through the stack again. "Everyone has secrets. Everyone has weakness." His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the photos in chronological order for the 100th time. The burner phone he'd started carrying buzzed on his desk. "We have a problem," the voice said without preamble. "James Wilson committed suicide last night." Daniel's hand tightened on the phone until his knuckles went white. Wilson had been their star witness, prepared to testify that the fraudulent transactions were standard industry practice. His testimony would have legitimized everything. "What happened?" Left a note. Said he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Mentioned you specifically. Local news already has the story. It's going viral. The phone shattered against the wall. Wilson had been his ace in the hole, the one witness who could have justified the financial dealings that were looking increasingly criminal under Judge Washington's unforgiving scrutiny. Now he'd have to find another way. Rain continued to pour as his town car carried him to the courthouse the next morning. The driver kept glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, clearly aware of his passenger's volatile mood. Daniel ignored him, scrolling through news coverage of Wilson's death on his tablet. Every outlet was running the story, complete with quotes from Wilson's family about harassment and threats. The morning's court session began with Catherine Bennett addressing the suicide. Her tailored navy suit and confident stance projected exactly the kind of female authority that made Daniel's skin crawl. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to enter Mr. Wilson's suicide note into evidence. His last words detail extensive witness tampering by the defendant." "Objection." Daniel shot to his feet, his expensive Italian shoes squeaking slightly on the polished courtroom floor. "This is prejudicial hearsay from an obviously disturbed individual." Judge Washington's gaze was sharp enough to cut diamond. "Mr. Remington, you're not in a boardroom. Shouting doesn't make your legal argument stronger." "This is ridiculous," Daniel spat, his carefully maintained facade cracking. The man was clearly unstable. "The note will be admitted," Judge Washington ruled, her tone brooking no argument. "The jury has the right to evaluate Mr. Wilson's final testimony. Ms. Bennett, proceed." Catherine Bennett unfolded the note with careful reverence. As she read Wilson's words aloud, Daniel watched the jury's faces harden one by one. The note was devastating. Detailed accounts of how Daniel had threatened Wilson's family, promised to destroy his career, and finally broke him with relentless pressure. "He said he'd make sure my kids never got into college," Bennett read from the note. "Said he'd destroy my wife's small business. Said no one would ever hire me again. I can't live with what I helped him do to those people. I can't face my family, knowing I helped steal their futures." The next witness called was Lisa Chen, a former employee from the accounting department. Daniel's jaw clenched as she took the stand. Another woman, another minority, another person he'd considered beneath him, now holding power over his fate. "Ms. Chen," Catherine Bennett began, "please tell the court about your experiences at Remington Corp." "I worked in accounting for 6 years, Lisa testified, her voice steady. "I had perfect performance reviews until I noticed irregular transfers from the pension accounts." "And what happened when you reported these transfers?" Mr. Remington called me to his office. "He said I should be grateful he'd hired a diversity candidate at all. Said maybe I wasn't smart enough to understand complex financial matters." During cross-examination, Daniel's frustration boiled over. "So you're claiming you were fired for questioning company practices?" His voice dripped with condescension. "Not because you were incompetent?" "I had perfect performance reviews until I reported the irregular transfers." "Perhaps you were promoted beyond your abilities in the first place. We had certain diversity quotas to meet." Daniel's lip curled in a sneer. Judge Washington's gavel cracked like thunder. "Mr. Remington, you will conduct yourself professionally, or you will be held in contempt." Daniel turned on her, his rage finally breaking through completely. "Oh, I'm sure you're very familiar with diversity quotas, Your Honor." "Bailiff, remove Mr. Remington from my courtroom. We'll resume when he remembers his manners." As security let him out, Daniel caught sight of reporters scribbling furiously. His outburst would make headlines, but he was past caring. Let them see his anger. Let them all see what happened when people like them tried to tear down men like him. In the marble-lined courthouse bathroom, Daniel splashed cold water on his face, trying to regain his composure. The door opened behind him with a soft click. "Rough morning?" The man who entered wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I might be able to help with your judicial problem." Daniel studied him in the mirror, noting the perfect cut of his suit, the heavy gold watch, the air of quiet menace. "Who are you?" "Let's say I represent certain interests who'd prefer Judge Washington. Reconsider her handling of your case." "I'm listening." Daniel turned around slowly, drying his hands on a paper towel. "We can arrange for her to receive some concerning information about her family's safety." Nothing direct, just enough to make her nervous. Make her understand the risks of going after certain people. Daniel wadded up the paper towel, tossing it perfectly into the trash. Do it. That afternoon, as testimony resumed, a bailiff handed Judge Washington a note. She read it, her expression unchanging, then had a quiet word with her security detail. Daniel watched eagerly for signs of distress, but her composure never wavered. If anything, her questioning became more incisive, her rulings more decisive. Days passed. More witnesses came forward. Daniel's cross-examinations grew increasingly hostile as his desperation mounted. Ms. Roberts, he sneered at Margaret Roberts, a former board member. Isn't it true you only got your position because I needed a woman on the board? Objection, Your Honor. Catherine Bennett stood, badgering the witness. Sustained. Judge Washington's voice could have cut steel. Mr. Remington, this is your final warning about inappropriate conduct toward witnesses. Of course, Your Honor, Daniel smiled viciously. We wouldn't want to upset the delicate ladies. Margaret Roberts leaned forward, her gray hair and elegant suit projecting decades of corporate experience. Mr. Remington, I have 3 doctoral degrees and ran a Fortune 500 company before joining your board. The only reason I accepted the position was to investigate rumors of fraud. I'm hardly delicate. Before Daniel could respond, his burner phone buzzed in his pocket. He'd forgotten to leave it in his office. Judge Washington's eyes narrowed at the sound. Mr. Remington, surrender that device immediately. I don't know what you're talking about, Your Honor. He shifted in his expensive leather chair, trying to silence the phone without being obvious. Bailiff, please search the defendant. Daniel backed away from the approaching security officer. You can't do this. I have rights. The phone was discovered. And worse, its call history showed contacts with known jury tampering operations. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as the bailiff handed the phone to Judge Washington. Your Honor, Catherine Bennett pounced, rising from her chair with fluid grace. The prosecution moves to revoke the defendant's bail. Judge Washington studied Daniel thoughtfully, turning the phone over in her hands. Given this new evidence of attempted jury tampering, I'm inclined to agree. However, she turned to the jury box. Has anyone been contacted about this case? 2 jurors raised their hands, looking nervous but determined. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Daniel saw his last chances slipping away like water through his fingers. In desperation, he lunged toward Judge Washington's bench. This is a setup. You planned this. You manipulative. Security tackled him before he could finish. As they dragged him away, Judge Washington's voice followed him. Mr. Remington, you are hereby remanded to custody pending trial. We'll resume with a new jury next week. In the holding cell, Daniel's rage finally broke completely. He screamed until his voice gave out, pounding the concrete walls until his hands bled. The guards watched impassively, used to seeing powerful men reduced to this state. Hours later, his new court-appointed attorney visited, a tired-looking public defender named Mark Stevens. They're offering a deal, 20 years instead of life. You should take it. Never. Daniel's voice was hoarse from screaming. I'll destroy her first. Mr. Remington, please. It's over. The jury tampering, the witness intimidation, the racial comments. You've given them everything they need. The new jury will be even more carefully screened. Your only hope is to show remorse and take the deal. Get out. Alone again, Daniel paced his cell like a caged tiger. His designer suit was wrinkled and stained, his manicured nails broken and bloody from pounding the walls. Everything he'd built was crumbling, and that woman, that black woman he dismissed as beneath him, was systematically taking it all away. Through his cell window, he could see the lights of Manhattan twinkling, in the distance. Somewhere out there, Judge Washington was probably working late again, unmoved by his threats, unbothered by his tantrums, methodically ensuring that justice would be served. The next morning, they dressed him in an orange jumpsuit for court. His last piece of dignity stripped away. The rough fabric felt like sandpaper against his skin, a constant reminder of his fall from power. But as they led him into the courtroom, Daniel spotted something that made his heart race, a new face. In the gallery, someone he recognized from darker dealings in his past. The man was unremarkable looking. That was his talent. He could blend into any crowd. But Daniel knew him as one of the most dangerous fixers in the city, someone who solved problems permanently. The man nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. He had one last card to play. One final way to show Judge Alexandria Washington that no one crossed Daniel Remington without consequences. Everything was arranged. All he had to do was wait. The session began, but Daniel barely heard the proceedings. He was too busy, watching the mysterious man in the gallery, waiting for his signal. Soon, he thought, soon she'll learn what happens to people who try to destroy men like him. But as the morning wore on, he noticed something wrong. Court security was unusually high. The mysterious man seemed uncomfortable, checking his phone repeatedly. More armed, officers entered the courtroom, taking up strategic positions. During a recess, Daniel overheard guards talking. The FBI had intercepted communications about a planned attack on the courthouse. All his co-conspirators were already in custody. When Judge Washington returned to the bench, she looked directly at Daniel. Her small smile told him she knew exactly what he'd tried to do, and how completely he'd failed. "Shall we continue, Mr. Remington?" Daniel slumped in his chair, the fight finally draining from him. For the first time in his life, he faced an opponent he couldn't beat, couldn't bribe, couldn't threaten or intimidate into submission. A woman who saw through every scheme, anticipated every move, and remained utterly unshakable. And the trial was only halfway done. Justice, it seemed, wore judges' robes and had absolutely no fear of men like Daniel Remington. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the prison consultation room as Daniel Remington adjusted his ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. His silver hair, usually perfectly styled, hung limp and unwashed. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, making him look older than his 52 years. Across the metal table, Elizabeth Bradford, his former executive assistant, watched him with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. "I have everything, Mr. Remington," Elizabeth said, placing a thick folder on the table. "Every conversation, every threat, every illegal order you gave me over the past decade. I kept records of everything." Daniel's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. "I made you, Elizabeth. You were nothing before I hired you." "You're right." She smoothed her blazer, a designer piece bought with the salary he'd once paid her. "I was a naive girl from Minnesota who thought working for the great Daniel Remington would be a dream come true. Instead, you taught me to document everything, to always have leverage. You taught me well. Name your price." His voice cracked with desperation. "Whatever they're paying you to testify, I'll double it." Elizabeth stood, gathering her designer handbag, another fruit of her years working for him. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about money. This is about all the lives you've destroyed, all the women you've harassed, all the families you've ruined." As she walked to the door, Daniel called after her, "You ungrateful little bit. Goodbye, Mr. Remington. I'll see you in court." The metal door clanged shut behind her, leaving Daniel alone with his rage. Through the small window, he could see his new reality. Guards, bars, concrete walls. A far cry from his penthouse view of Central Park. The next morning, as they led him into the courtroom, Daniel noticed something different. A juror was missing, replaced by an alternate. Judge Alexandria Washington addressed the change immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must inform you that juror number 4 reported being followed last night. The FBI is investigating this incident. Mr. Remington," her dark eyes fixed on him, "would you like to explain why your private investigator was photographed outside a juror's home?" Daniel forced his face into a mask of innocence. "Your Honor, I have no knowledge of—" "Save it." Judge Washington's voice could have frozen hellfire. "Your investigator is already cooperating with authorities. This is your final warning. Any further attempts to tamper with this jury will result in additional charges. Proceed, Ms. Bennett." Catherine Bennett rose from the prosecution table, her tailored suit a sharp contrast to Daniel's prison orange. The prosecution calls Elizabeth Bradford to the stand. For the next 3 hours, Elizabeth methodically destroyed him. She detailed every illegal transaction, every instance of harassment, every corrupt decision. Her testimony was devastating, not just for its content, but for its precise, unshakable delivery. Mr. Remington had a specific protocol for female employees, Elizabeth explained, her voice steady. Young, attractive women were hired for visible positions, regardless of qualifications. He called it decorating the office. Those who complained were terminated. Those who played along were harassed. Those who threatened legal action were paid off and blacklisted. Daniel jumped up. Objection. This is character assassination. Mr. Remington, Judge Washington's tone dripped with disdain. That's not a valid legal objection. If you insist on representing yourself, at least attempt to understand basic courtroom procedure. Sit down. The jury watched this exchange with obvious disapproval. Daniel could feel his chances slipping away with every passing minute. During the lunch recess, he paced his holding cell, muttering to himself. The guards exchanged worried glances. Back in court, Catherine Bennett called her next witness, Dr. James Sullivan, a forensic accountant. Using clear graphics and simple analogies, he explained the complexity of Daniel's fraud to the jury. Think of it like a shell game, Sullivan said, demonstrating with 3 cups and a ball. Mr. Remington moved money between accounts so quickly, regulators couldn't track it. But we followed every transaction, every dollar he stole from pension funds, every fake investment, every hidden account. Daniel's objections grew increasingly desperate. This is speculation. He's biased. He's just jealous of my success. Judge Washington's patience wore visibly thin. Mr. Remington, if you interrupt one more time without a valid legal basis, you will be removed from my courtroom. The afternoon brought another surprise. A familiar face entered the courtroom. Monica Remington, Daniel's ex-wife. She walked to the witness stand with quiet dignity, refusing to look at her former husband. Ms. Remington, Catherine Bennett began, when did you first become aware of the defendant's illegal activities? Monica's testimony painted a picture of a man consumed by power and hatred. She described watching Daniel's transformation from ambitious businessman to corrupt tyrant. His rage issues, his growing paranoia, his particular hatred for successful women and minorities. He couldn't stand answering to anyone, Monica explained. But women in authority drove him especially crazy. He'd rant for hours about diversity, hires ruining American business. When Judge Washington was assigned to this case, he completely lost it. Objection, Daniel's voice cracked. This is my wife, ex-wife, Monica corrected coldly. She's lying. She's bitter about the divorce. Mr. Remington, Judge Washington interrupted, control yourself or be removed. But Daniel was beyond control. You planned this, all of you women, conspiring together. 2 guards grabbed his arms as he tried to approach the witness stand. Monica didn't flinch, her calm testimony continuing even as they dragged him from the courtroom. In his holding cell, Daniel watched the proceedings on a small monitor. Without him present, the prosecution's case moved smoothly. Expert witnesses, financial records, surveillance footage. Everything he'd built crumbling under the weight of evidence. Later that afternoon, his court-appointed standby counsel visited. Mr. Remington, you need to apologize to the court. Show some remorse. The jury is rigged, Daniel snarled. The judge is biased. The whole system is corrupt. Sir, please. I've seen cases like this before. Your only hope is to get out. You're as useless as all the others. Alone again, Daniel paced his cell like a caged animal. Through the window, he could see the sun setting over Manhattan. Somewhere in that glittering skyline, his empire was being dismantled piece by piece. The next morning, they allowed him back in court, under strict conditions. No speaking without permission, no approaching the bench. Armed guards on either side. Catherine Bennett called her final witness of the day, Thomas Anderson, Daniel's former chauffeur. Mr. Anderson, Bennett began, tell us about the conversation. You overheard between Mr. Remington and his private investigator. Objection. Daniel tried to stand, but the guards held him down. Judge Washington didn't even look his way. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Anderson. It was right after Judge Washington was assigned the case, Anderson testified. Mr. Remington was in the back of the car on his phone. He was ordering someone to find dirt on the judge, said he didn't care what it took or who they had to hurt, said he'd never let a black woman destroy everything he'd built. The jury's expressions hardened further. Daniel could practically see his future disappearing with each damning testimony. During the afternoon recess, a note was slipped into his hand. Insurance policy ready. Say the word. His last-ditch contingency plan. A way to make sure that if he went down, he wouldn't go down alone. Back in court, Catherine Bennett played her final card. Your Honor, the prosecution calls Marcus Reynolds. Daniel's blood ran cold. The junior executive he'd repeatedly passed over for promotion. The one he'd mocked in countless meetings. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Marcus had been working with the FBI for months. Mr. Reynolds, Bennett began, please tell the court about the recording device in Mr. Remington's office. For the next hour, Marcus played, selected clips from months of secret recordings. Daniel's own voice filled the courtroom, spewing hatred, ordering illegal actions, threatening enemies. The real Daniel Remington, stripped of his polished facade. I want those pension funds emptied by Friday, his voice snarled from the speakers. I don't care about the retirees. Let them eat cat food. Another clip. Keep the pretty ones up front where clients can see them. The rest can work in the basement, and fire anyone over 40, they're dead weight. And worst of all, a recording from the day Judge Washington was assigned his case. Find something we can use against her. Everyone has secrets, and if we can't find any, we'll create some. That uppity black bitch needs to learn her place. The courtroom fell silent as the recordings ended. Daniel could feel every eye on him, could see the disgust on the jurors' faces. Even his guard seemed to stand slightly further away. Catherine Bennett rose slowly. The prosecution rests, Your Honor. Judge Washington turned to Daniel. Mr. Remington, you may present your defense. Daniel looked around the courtroom, at the jury who'd heard his true voice, at his ex-wife who'd exposed his private monstrosity, at Elizabeth who'd documented his crimes, at Marcus who'd recorded his unguarded moments. Finally, he looked at Judge Washington. She met his gaze calmly, radiating the quiet authority that had driven him mad from day one. In that moment, he realized the truth. He'd never had a chance against her. His power had always been an illusion built on intimidation and corruption. Hers was real, earned through intelligence and integrity. Mr. Remington, she prompted. Your defense? Daniel slumped in his chair. No defense, Your Honor. A murmur ran through the gallery. Judge Washington raised an eyebrow. Are you saying you rest your case without presenting evidence? What's the point? His voice was barely audible. You've won. You've all won. Mr. Remington, this isn't about winning. This is about justice. He laughed bitterly. Justice? I don't even know what that means anymore. Judge Washington studied him for a long moment. Then perhaps it's time you learned. Court is adjourned until tomorrow for closing arguments. As they led him back to his cell, Daniel remembered the note in his pocket. His insurance policy. 1. Last chance to hurt them all. But as he reached for it, Judge Washington's words echoed in his mind. This isn't about winning. He tore the note into tiny pieces, letting them fall like confetti around his feet. That night, alone in his cell, Daniel Remington finally confronted the truth. He was finished. His money couldn't save him. His connections couldn't help him. His threats couldn't scare anyone anymore. Tomorrow, the lawyers would make their closing arguments. The jury would begin deliberations, and Daniel would wait, like any other prisoner, to learn his fate. Through his tiny window, he could just see the courthouse where Judge Washington's office light still burned, still working, still unshakable, still everything he wasn't. Daniel turned away from the window and faced his blank cell wall. For the first time in his adult life, he had no power, no control, and nowhere left to hide from himself. The night stretched endlessly before him. The prosecution's multimedia presentation filled the courtroom screens with faces, hundreds of them, each representing a life destroyed by Daniel Remington's fraud. Gray-haired retirees who'd lost their pensions, single mothers laid off without warning, young families whose savings had vanished. Catherine Bennett's voice carried steady and clear as she introduced each victim. Robert Anderson, 68 years old, worked at Remington Manufacturing for 42 years, lost his entire pension, now works nights as a security guard to afford his wife's medication. Daniel shifted in his prison jumpsuit, unable to escape the weight of so many accusing eyes. The orange fabric scratched against his skin, a constant reminder of his fall from power. Sarah Martinez, 34, single mother of 3. Terminated, without cause after reporting irregular accounting practices. Blacklisted from the industry, currently works 2 jobs to make ends meet. Judge Alexandria Washington watched the presentation with quiet intensity, her dark eyes occasionally flicking to Daniel, measuring his reactions. He tried to maintain his mask of indifference, but his hands trembled slightly on the defense table. James Wilson. Catherine Bennett's voice softened. Former executive, father of 2, drove himself to suicide rather than live with the guilt of helping Mr. Remington steal from these people. The jury's expressions hardened. Several wiped away tears. As the victims' stories continued, Daniel watched his chances of acquittal crumbling with each new face on the screen. During a brief recess, his court-appointed attorney tried one last time to reason with him. Mr. Remington, please reconsider taking a deal. These victim impact statements are destroying us. Shut up, Daniel snarled, but his voice lacked its former authority. The weeks in custody had stripped away his polished veneer, revealing the desperate man beneath. Back in session, Catherine Bennett called her star witness, Grace Henderson, a 70-year-old widow whose husband had worked for Remington Corp. for 35 years. Mrs. Henderson, Bennett began gently, please tell the court what happened after your husband lost his pension. Grace's voice quavered, but remained strong. Tom had a heart condition. When the pension disappeared, we couldn't afford his medications anymore. He tried to hide how bad it was getting, took on odd jobs despite his health. One morning, she paused, dabbing her eyes. One morning I woke up and he was gone. The doctor said his heart just gave out. And what did Mr. Remington say when you wrote to him about your situation? Grace's voice hardened. He had his secretary send a form letter suggesting we should have managed our money better. Daniel remembered that letter. He'd barely glanced at it before telling his staff to send the standard response. Now, watching Grace Henderson's quiet dignity, something uncomfortable stirred in his chest. He pushed the feeling away. The prosecution's forensic accountant took the stand next, breaking down the complex fraud into simple terms. Mr. Remington created a sophisticated shell game, he explained, using clear graphics. Money from pension funds was moved through multiple offshore accounts, then invested in high-risk ventures that primarily benefited Mr. Remington and his inner circle. Objection! Daniel stood, his chains rattling. This is speculation. Mr. Remington, Judge Washington's voice cut through his protest. The witness is a certified forensic accountant presenting documented evidence. Objection overruled. The morning wore on. More victims, more evidence, more desperate objections from Daniel that only made him look worse. During lunch break, a commotion erupted outside the courthouse. Hundreds of Remington Corp victims had gathered, holding signs with photos of their loved ones. News cameras captured it all. Back in session, Catherine Bennett dropped another bombshell. Your Honor, the prosecution has obtained new evidence of Mr. Remington's attempts to tamper with these proceedings. Daniel's blood ran cold as Bennett played a series of recorded phone calls he'd made from prison. His own voice filled the courtroom, ordering hits on witnesses, attempting to bribe jurors, and making explicit threats against Judge Washington. I don't care what it takes, his recorded voice snarled. That black bitch needs to learn her place. Make it look like an accident. The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Washington's expression remained impassive, but her eyes locked onto Daniel with steel-hard intensity. Furthermore, Bennett continued, we've discovered Mr. Remington has been secretly transferring assets to accounts in non-extradition countries. A series of financial documents appeared on the screens. Wire transfers, shell companies, elaborate plans for escape. Your Honor, Bennett's voice carried perfect conviction. The prosecution moves to have all of Mr. Remington's remaining assets frozen immediately. No! Daniel lunged forward, his chains catching him. You can't do this. That's my money. Mr. Remington, Judge Washington's tone could have frozen fire. That's exactly what we're here to determine. Motion granted. All assets are frozen pending the outcome of this trial. The afternoon brought a parade of former employees testifying about Daniel's discrimination, harassment, and retaliation against anyone who questioned his practices. He had a special name for female executives, one witness revealed. Called them his diversity decorations, said they were just for show. Another described how Daniel systematically pushed out older workers. He said anyone over 50 was dead weight. Told us to find reasons to fire them before their pensions vested. Daniel's objections grew increasingly unhinged. This is a conspiracy. They're all lying. This whole system is rigged against successful white men. Remove the defendant until he can control himself, Judge Washington ordered. As guards led him out, Daniel caught a glimpse of the jury's faces. The disgust there told him everything. In his holding cell, watching the proceedings on a small monitor, Daniel saw his empire crumbling in real time. Catherine Bennett methodically presented evidence of every crime, every act of corruption, every life he destroyed in his pursuit of power and wealth. A guard appeared at his cell. You have a visitor. Daniel looked up to see Richard Palmer, his former attorney, standing there. The man who'd quit rather than participate in Daniel's schemes. What do you want? Daniel growled. To give you one last chance. Palmer's voice was tired but firm. They're still willing to deal if you agree to help recover assets for the victims. Never. Palmer sighed. Then I hope it was worth it, Daniel. All those lives you ruined. All that pain you caused. I hope your pride was worth it. After Palmer left, Daniel paced his cell like a caged animal. Through his window, he could see news vans surrounding the courthouse. His face appeared on their screens, alongside graphics showing the scale of his crimes. When they finally led him back to court, Catherine Bennett was preparing her closing argument. She stood before the jury, her presence commanding attention. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard weeks of testimony. You've seen thousands of documents. You've listened to Mr. Remington's own words. But this case isn't really about numbers on spreadsheets or complex financial schemes. It's about people. Real people whose lives were shattered by one man's greed. She gestured to the gallery packed with victims. Look at these faces. Remember their stories. Remember Grace Henderson, whose husband died because he couldn't afford medicine. Remember the children who lost their college funds. Remember James Wilson, who paid the ultimate price for his part in this fraud. Daniel watched the jury nodding, several wiping away tears. Mr. Remington sits here today, still showing no remorse, still attacking anyone who dares stand up to him, still believing himself above the law. But in this courtroom, we are all equal. Justice wears a blindfold for a reason. She turned to Daniel, her voice steel hard. The evidence is clear. The damage is documented. The victims cry out for justice. We ask you to deliver that justice. Find Daniel Remington guilty on all counts. When it was Daniel's turn for closing arguments, he stood unsteadily. The weeks in custody had taken their toll. His once commanding presence had withered. This is persecution, he began, his voice hoarse. I built something great, employed thousands, created wealth, and now they want to destroy me because I wouldn't bow to their diversity agenda, wouldn't play their political games. Judge Washington's gavel cut him off. Mr. Remington, contain your closing argument to the evidence presented. Evidence? He laughed bitterly. The evidence is that I succeeded in a world that resents success, that I refuse to apologize for winning, that I... Mr. Remington. Judge Washington's voice could have cut diamond. One more outburst and you. Forfeit your closing argument. Address the actual charges. But Daniel was past caring. You think you've won, don't you? You and all the other diversity hires trying to tear down everything men like me built. But you'll never. Bailiff, remove the defendant. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are instructed to disregard Mr. Remington's statements. As they led him out, Daniel caught one last glimpse of Judge Washington. She watched him with something like pity in her eyes, which somehow hurt worse than anger would have. The jury received their instructions and filed out to deliberate. Daniel waited in his cell, alternating between rage and despair. Hours passed. Then a buzz of activity. They had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed as Daniel was led in. News cameras tracked his every move. Judge Washington called for order. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The forewoman stood. We have, Your Honor. Daniel held his breath. This was it. His last chance. On the count of conspiracy to commit securities fraud, how do you find? Guilty. On the count of grand larceny? Guilty. On the count of witness tampering? Guilty. The guilty verdicts continued, count after count. Daniel felt each one like a physical blow. When it was done, when his fate was sealed, Judge Washington addressed him directly. Mr. Remington, you will remain in custody pending sentencing. I will review victim impact statements and determine restitution amounts. We will reconvene in 1 week. As guards led him away, Daniel looked back at his victims in the gallery, at the jury who'd condemned him, at Catherine Bennett, who'd exposed his crimes, at Judge Alexandria Washington, who'd presided over his downfall with unwavering integrity. He'd spent his life believing power came from money, from fear, from the ability to bully and intimidate. Only now, watching Judge Washington gather her papers with quiet dignity, did he understand true power. The power of justice. The power of truth. The power of a woman he'd underestimated, proving exactly why she deserved her position. In his cell that night, Daniel Remington, former titan of industry, now just another convicted felon, waited for sleep that wouldn't come. Through his window, he could see the courthouse where it had all ended, where a black female judge had shown him what real authority looked like. The worst part wasn't losing his money. It wasn't losing his freedom. It wasn't even facing his victims. The worst part was knowing that Judge Alexandria Washington had beaten him not through force or fraud, but through simple, unshakable integrity, the one weapon he'd never understood how to use. The Securities and Exchange Commission moved at dawn. As first light touched the gleaming towers of Manhattan, teams of federal agents simultaneously entered every Remington Corp office across the country. In the New York headquarters, shell-shocked employees watched as investigators seized computers, files, and servers. From his prison cell, Daniel Remington could only watch helplessly on the small television as his empire crumbled in real time. CNBC showed live footage of SEC officials leading his top executives out in handcuffs. The ticker at the bottom of the screen tracked Remington Corp stock plummeting to pennies. "Turn it off," he snapped at the guard, but his voice cracked. The guard ignored him. "Breaking news," the anchor announced. "The SEC has frozen all Remington Corporation assets pending a complete investigation. Trading of Remington stock has been suspended. Sources say the fraud may extend far beyond initial estimates." The morning brought more devastation. Daniel's court-appointed attorney arrived with a stack of papers. "The federal marshals are seizing your properties," he explained, spreading documents across the visiting room table. "Your Manhattan penthouse, the Hampton estate, the ski lodge in Aspen." Daniel stared at the papers, his hands trembling slightly. "They can't do this. Those are my personal assets. Purchased with fraudulent funds, according to the evidence. The government is seizing everything. Everything. Everything except your prison jumpsuit, basically." The lawyer shuffled more papers. "Your accounts are frozen, credit cards canceled. The SEC is even going after your offshore holdings." Daniel leaned back in his chair, trying to process the magnitude of his loss. Just weeks ago, he'd been worth billions. Now he couldn't even buy a candy bar from the prison commissary. The television in the common area brought more news throughout the day. His former business partners were turning on him, rushing to cooperate with authorities to save themselves. Michael Preston, former CFO of Remington Corp., has agreed to testify about systematic fraud dating back decades, a reporter announced. Sources say Preston has provided prosecutors with detailed records of illegal transactions. Daniel remembered promoting Preston, thinking the man's obvious weakness would make him easy to control. Now that weakness was helping destroy everything Daniel had built. In the courthouse, Judge Alexandria Washington was overseeing the dismantling of his financial empire with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown during his trial. The court orders an immediate freeze on all suspicious transactions, she declared, reviewing evidence of last-minute attempts to hide assets. Any transfer made since the investigation began will be scrutinized. The afternoon brought news that Daniel's private jet had been caught trying to smuggle documents out of the country. FBI agents intercepted the plane in Teterboro, finding boxes of incriminating records the crew had been ordered to fly to a remote airfield in Central America. The pilots are cooperating, his lawyer informed him during another grim meeting. They're saying you personally ordered the document removal. Daniel said nothing. He remembered giving those orders, believing himself untouchable. Now each decision was coming back to haunt him. More betrayals followed. His private banker in Switzerland decided that client confidentiality wasn't worth facing American prosecutors. Suddenly, Daniel's secret accounts weren't so secret anymore. We've received evidence that Mr. Remington bribed officials in multiple countries to conceal his financial crimes, Catherine Bennett announced to the press. The scope of corruption is staggering. The headlines grew worse by the hour. Remington empire crumbles. Thousands of jobs at risk. Pension funds wiped out. Then came the personal humiliations. His alma mater, Yale University, announced they were removing his name from the business school building he'd donated millions to create. The Metropolitan Museum of Art returned his donations and removed him from their board. His country club revoked his membership. Even his charity work, carefully crafted to burnish his image, was exposed as fraudulent. Investigation revealed that his foundation had been a shell, using less than 1% of its funds for actual charitable work while serving as a tax shelter and slush fund. Your Hampton estate was raided this morning, his lawyer reported. They found evidence that you were using charitable donations to pay for personal expenses, private jets, luxury cars, even your household staff were being paid through the foundation. Daniel remembered signing those documents, laughing at how easy it was to manipulate the system. The memory tasted like ashes now. The media discovered his secret family in Connecticut, a mistress and 2 children he'd kept hidden for years. His attempts to transfer money to them had triggered SEC alerts, exposing the carefully concealed relationship. Mr. Remington's pattern of deception extended to every aspect of his life, Catherine Bennett told reporters. He created elaborate fictions to hide his crimes, his assets, and even his own family. His legitimate family wasn't faring much better. His ex-wife gave a scathing interview to the New York Times, describing years of emotional abuse and financial manipulation. His adult children publicly denounced him, changing their surnames to their mother's maiden name. The business media that had once celebrated him now competed to expose his crimes. Forbes ran a cover story titled, "The Fall of a Titan," featuring a harsh photo of Daniel in his prison jumpsuit. The Wall Street Journal published a detailed investigation of his decades-long fraud. His attempt to declare personal bankruptcy failed spectacularly when hidden assets were discovered. The court finds this bankruptcy petition was filed in bad faith, Judge Washington ruled. Mr. Remington continues to conceal assets while claiming insolvency. The petition is denied. Even his legal defense was crumbling. Without access to his money, he could no longer afford high-powered attorneys. His court-appointed lawyer looked increasingly overwhelmed. They're finding new evidence every day, the lawyer admitted. Shell, companies, hidden accounts, bribes. The prosecutors have more than they even presented at trial. Daniel's former executive assistant provided prosecutors with a decade's worth of incriminating emails and recordings. She documented every illegal order, every threat, every instance of harassment. Mr. Remington made it clear that protecting himself was our only priority, she testified. We were ordered to destroy records, lie to regulators, and silence anyone who questioned his methods, His private security team turned over recordings of him ordering surveillance on critics, including judges and journalists. The recordings revealed explicit racism and misogyny, particularly his hatred of successful women and minorities. The press descended on his former doorman, chauffeur, and household staff. They painted a picture of a man consumed by rage and paranoia, who terrorized employees and treated everyone as beneath him. He would practice his court appearances in the mirror, his former butler revealed, rehearsing how to look down on Judge Washington, how to show his contempt while avoiding more contempt charges. His prestigious prep school removed his photo from their Hall of Fame. Harvard Business School revoked his alumni status. The Manhattan Society that had once celebrated him now pretended they'd never known him. Daniel watched it all from his cell, feeling his world contract to the size of a prison block. The guard brought him courthouse updates with almost sadistic regularity. "They're seizing your art collection today," the guard informed him one morning. "Seems you bought most of those million-dollar paintings with stolen money." Television news showed workers carefully packing up the Picassos and Monets that had decorated his penthouse. He remembered buying them, caring more about their price tags than their beauty. Now they were evidence of his crimes. His phone privileges brought only more bad news. Most calls went unanswered. The few who did pick up quickly made excuses to hang up. "Sorry, Danny," an old friend said. "Can't be associated with you right now. You understand." He understood perfectly. He'd done the same to others during his rise to power, discarding anyone who might slow his ascent. Now he was the one being discarded. Judge Washington continued methodically dismantling his financial schemes. She showed particular interest in his attacks on whistleblowers. "The court orders full restitution to employees who were terminated for reporting fraud," she declared. "Their careers were destroyed for trying to do the right thing." Daniel remembered those employees, the ones he'd crushed for daring to question him. He'd thought himself so clever, using NDAs and legal threats to silence them. Now their testimony was helping destroy him. His lawyer brought more papers to sign, more assets to forfeit. The government was even seizing his watches and cufflinks, arguing they'd been purchased with criminal proceeds. "They're investigating your art donations now," the lawyer reported. "Apparently you inflated the values for tax purposes. The IRS is involved." Daniel barely reacted. He'd lost track of all the investigations, all the charges, all the betrayals. His carefully constructed world was being deconstructed piece by piece, every secret exposed, every crime documented. The media found more victims of his fraud. A steady stream of retirees, former employees, and ruined investors told their stories. Many had lost everything while he lived in luxury. "Mr. Remington fired me when I was diagnosed with cancer," a former secretary revealed. "Said he didn't want damaged goods in his office. I lost my health insurance right when I needed it most." His former driver provided recordings of his rants against Judge Washington, capturing his racist and sexist tirades. The recordings went viral, destroying any remaining public sympathy. "A black woman thinks she can judge me?" His voice snarled on the tapes. "I've got more power in my little finger than she'll ever have." Judge Washington listened to the recordings without reaction, then calmly ordered another set of accounts. Frozen. Her quiet competence felt like a personal rebuke to his hatred. His lawyer brought news that even his prep school roommate, now a senator, was distancing himself. "He's issued a statement saying he barely knew you, despite all those donations you made to his campaigns." Daniel remembered writing those checks, buying influence he thought would last forever. Now his money was toxic, his name poison to anyone who'd ever associated with him. The SEC investigation revealed decades of systematic fraud. Every deal, every transaction, every aspect of his business empire had been built on corruption. Mr. Remington created a complex web of deception, a federal investigator testified. He used shareholder money as his personal fund, treating public companies like private piggy banks. His attempts to hide assets became increasingly desperate. He tried to transfer property to distant relatives, create new shell companies, even bury gold in his Hampton Estates garden. "The defendant continues to demonstrate contempt for the law," Catherine Bennett argued. "Even from prison, he's trying to hide assets that rightfully belong to his victims." Judge Washington ordered heightened scrutiny of his communications. Mr. Remington has shown he cannot be trusted with any financial control. All his transactions, no matter how small, must be monitored. The final blow came when his youngest daughter gave an interview to CNN. "My father taught me that money was everything," she said, "that people only mattered if they could be useful to you. I'm just grateful Judge Washington showed me a different kind of power, the power of integrity." Daniel turned off the TV. After that, he sat in his cell, surrounded by crumbling papers detailing the destruction of his empire. Everything he'd built, everything he'd stolen, everything he'd thought defined him, all of it was being stripped away. Through his window, he could see a slice of the Manhattan skyline he'd once dominated. His former building, Remington Tower, was being renamed. Workers were already removing his name from the facade. Judge Washington's courtroom light still burned late into the night. She worked tirelessly, ensuring every victim would be heard, every asset would be traced, every crime would be answered for. Daniel finally understood what real power looked like. Not his hollow empire built on fraud and fear, but her quiet authority, built on principle and integrity. She didn't need to shout or threaten. She simply ensured justice was done. His lawyer's words echoed in his mind. Everything except your prison jumpsuit. That's what his life had become. Everything stripped away except the orange uniform that marked him as just another criminal. All his power, all his wealth, all his carefully constructed superiority, gone. And in the end, he had been undone not by force or violence, but by the quiet determination of a black woman he'd thought himself too powerful to fear. Judge Alexandria Washington had destroyed him simply by doing her job with unshakable integrity. Daniel Remington, once master of a financial empire, lay on his prison cot and watched shadows crawl across the ceiling. Outside his window, Manhattan's lights twinkled on one by one, the city moving on without him. His empire was gone. His name was mud. His legacy was destruction. And somewhere in that glittering skyline, Judge Washington was still working, ensuring that justice would be complete. The mighty had fallen, and they had fallen hard. The morning of sentencing dawned clear and cold. Frost etched delicate patterns on the narrow window of Daniel Remington's cell as he struggled with his prison-issued clothing. His fingers, once adorned with custom cufflinks, fumbled with the cheap orange fabric. A year ago, he would have had a valet help him dress. Now a bored guard watched him struggle. "Time to go, Remington." The courthouse steps teemed with reporters and protesters. Signs bearing photographs of his victims dotted the crowd. Faces of the elderly who'd lost their pensions, families who'd lost their homes, employees whose lives he'd destroyed. Daniel kept his eyes down as guards led him through the gauntlet. "Justice for the victims," someone shouted. "Make him pay." Inside courtroom 318, every seat was filled. Catherine Bennett sat at the prosecution table, her posture radiating quiet confidence. The evidence boxes that had once cluttered the space were gone, their devastating contents already presented, their damage done. A hush fell over the room as Judge Alexandria Washington entered. Her black robe seemed to absorb the morning light streaming through the high windows. Daniel noticed silver threading through her dark hair. Had that been there at the start of the trial? How many hours had she spent ensuring justice was served? "Please be seated," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority it had since day one. "We're here for the sentencing of Daniel Remington, found guilty on all counts by a jury of his peers." Daniel's court-appointed attorney shifted, nervously beside him. They both knew what was coming. The only question was how severe the sentence would be. "Ms. Bennett, you may present your sentencing recommendations." Catherine Bennett rose slowly, holding a thick folder. "Your Honor, the prosecution recommends the maximum sentence on all counts to be served consecutively rather than concurrently." She began methodically outlining the scope of Daniel's crimes. The numbers were staggering. Billions stolen, thousands of lives ruined, decades of systematic fraud and corruption. "Moreover," Bennett continued, "Mr. Remington has shown no remorse. Even after conviction, he continued attempting to hide assets and threaten witnesses. He remains a danger to society and his victims." Daniel stared at his hands, noting how his skin had grown pale from months without sun. His manicured nails were ragged now, his fingers ink-stained from countless hours writing angry letters that never got sent. "The court will now hear victim impact statements," Judge Washington announced. "We have over 200 victims present today. Each will be given time to speak." For the next several hours, Daniel endured a parade of lives he'd destroyed. Each story carved new lines into his face, added new weight to his shoulders. Grace Henderson approached the podium, leaning on her cane. "My husband worked for you for 35 years, Mr. Remington. 35 years of loyal service. He died because we couldn't afford his heart medication after you stole our pension. I watch our grandchildren grow up without their grandfather, all because of your greed." A former employee, Robert Chen, spoke next. "You fired me for reporting fraud, then blacklisted me from the industry. My children had to leave college. My wife developed anxiety so severe she can't work. You didn't just steal money. You stole our future." Sarah Martinez, the single mother of 3, faced him directly. "You called me diversity window dressing and said I should be grateful for the job. Then you fired me for refusing your advances and questioning your ethics. My kids went hungry because of you." On and on it went. Parents who'd lost homes, students who'd lost educational opportunities, elderly couples forced back to work at an age when they should have been enjoying retirement. Judge Washington listened to each statement with full attention, occasionally making notes. Daniel noticed she never checked her watch, never rushed anyone, giving each victim their full moment to be heard. During a brief recess, Daniel's attorney tried one last time. "If you show remorse now, express genuine regret, it might help." "Shut up," Daniel muttered, but his voice lacked its former venom. He was just tired now. So tired. Back in session, Catherine Bennett presented her final arguments for sentencing. Mr. Remington's crimes weren't just about money. He attacked the very fabric of trust that makes our financial systems work. He betrayed employees who trusted him with their futures. He corrupted officials who were meant to protect the public. He threatened anyone who dared stand up to him. She turned to face Daniel directly. Even now, he shows no understanding of the lives he's destroyed, no recognition of the pain he's caused. He remains exactly what he's always been, a danger to society who believes himself above the law. Judge Washington nodded slowly. "Mr. Remington, you have the right to make a statement before sentencing. Would you like to speak?" Daniel stood, unsteadily. The courtroom seemed to spin slightly. How had it come to this? Him in Prison Orange, his empire in ruins, his fate in the hands of a woman he'd dismissed as beneath him. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I built something great, employed thousands, created wealth, and now you're destroying it all because I wouldn't play by your rules, wouldn't bow to your diversity quotas and political correctness." Murmurs of disgust rippled through the gallery. Judge Washington's expression didn't change, but her eyes hardened slightly. "Mr. Remington, this court has heard weeks of testimony proving systematic fraud, corruption, and criminal conduct. Your statement suggests you still fail to grasp the gravity of your crimes." She lifted a document. "I have reviewed all evidence, victim statements, and sentencing guidelines. I've considered every aspect of this case carefully. The damage you've done extends far beyond monetary theft. You've destroyed lives, broken families, shattered trust." The courtroom fell absolutely silent as she continued. "You've shown no remorse, no recognition of your crimes. Even now, you attempt to paint yourself as a victim while hundreds of real victims suffer the consequences of your actions." Judge Washington's voice remained steady, but carried absolute authority. "You seem to believe that rules don't apply to you, that your wealth and power put you above the law, that you could abuse, threaten, and destroy people without consequences." She met his eyes directly. "You were wrong." Daniel felt himself shrinking under her gaze. All his power, all his arrogance, all his carefully constructed superiority, none of it meant anything now. "On the count of conspiracy to commit securities fraud, I sentence you to 20 years. On the count of grand larceny, 20 years. On the count of witness tampering, 15 years. The sentences continued, each one another nail in the coffin of Daniel's freedom. When Judge Washington finished, the total was staggering: 120 years to be served consecutively. Furthermore, she continued, you are ordered to pay restitution to all victims with interest. Every asset you own or control will be liquidated. Every dollar you possess or earn will go toward repaying the people you've harmed. Daniel swayed slightly. 120 years. He'd be dead long before that sentence ended. You will serve your time in a maximum security facility, Judge Washington continued. Given your attempts to corrupt guards and threaten witnesses even while in custody, you will be subject to enhanced security protocols. She paused, studying him thoughtfully. Mr. Remington, you spent your life accumulating power through corruption, intimidation, and fraud. You used that power to hurt people you considered beneath you. You seemed to believe that money could buy anything: integrity, justice, even the law itself. The morning sun caught the silver in her hair as she delivered her final words. You were wrong about many things, but most of all about what real power looks like. Real power comes from integrity, not corruption. From justice, not intimidation. From serving the law, not believing yourself above it. She gestured to the gallery of victims. These people you dismissed as beneath you, they showed more dignity, more integrity, more real strength than you ever did. Remember that in the years ahead. Daniel barely heard the rest. His legs felt weak. 120 years. Every asset seized, every dollar forfeit. His name ruined, his empire destroyed. As guards led him away, he caught one last glimpse of Judge Washington. She was already reviewing documents for her next case, his fate decided, his power broken, justice served. In the holding cell, waiting for transport to prison, Daniel watched through his small window as reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Judge Washington's voice played from their satellite trucks. Justice has been served. He remembered the first day of trial, how he'd smirked at her, refused to stand, treated her with contempt. He'd seen only a black woman he thought he could bully or buy. He hadn't recognized real authority when it sat before him. The prison transport arrived. Not his private helicopter this time, but a heavily guarded van. As they drove through Manhattan, he caught glimpses of his former life. His company's name being removed from buildings, his properties being sold, his world being dismantled. Other prisoners watched him with mix of contempt and satisfaction as guards led him to his cell. The mighty Daniel Remington, reduced to just another number in the system. That night, alone in his cell, Daniel finally faced the truth. He'd spent his life building an empire on corruption, believing money equaled power. But true power had looked very different. It had worn judges' robes and carried itself with quiet dignity. It hadn't needed threats or bribes or intimidation. It had simply ensured that justice was done. Judge Alexandria Washington's final words echoed in his mind. Real power comes from integrity. He'd never understood that kind of power, never valued integrity or justice or truth. He'd believed himself untouchable, above the law, superior to everyone, especially a black female judge he'd dismissed as beneath him. Now he had the rest of his life to reflect on how wrong he'd been. Through his tiny window, he could just see the lights of Manhattan, twinkling in the distance. Somewhere in that glittering skyline, Judge Washington was probably still working, still ensuring justice was served, not through force or fear, but through unwavering integrity. Daniel turned away from the window and faced his blank cell wall. His designer suits were gone, replaced by prison denim. His manicured hands were rough from prison work. His carefully maintained silver hair was prison cut short. Everything he'd thought made him powerful had been stripped away. All that remained was the truth he'd spent his life avoiding. Real power, true authority, had nothing to do with money or intimidation or corruption. Real power looked like Judge Alexandria Washington, calmly dismantling his empire with nothing but integrity and the law. The night stretched endlessly before him, the first of thousands to come. In the darkness, Daniel Remington, once master of a financial empire, now just another prisoner serving a century-long sentence, finally understood what true power looked like. It hadn't looked anything like him. 5 years into his 120-year sentence, Daniel Remington sat in the prison visiting room, facing his former empire's final dismantling. His court-appointed attorney spread documents across the metal table, each paper another piece of his world being carved away. "The last of your overseas accounts has been located," the lawyer explained, his voice tired after years of managing Daniel's endless legal defeats. "The Swiss authorities finally cooperated. Everything's being liquidated for victim restitution." Daniel barely reacted. His once perfect silver hair had gone completely white, cropped close to his skull by prison barbers. Deep lines etched his face, and his prison uniform hung loose on his frame. The proud titan of industry had withered into just another aging inmate. "The bankruptcy proceedings are finally complete," the lawyer continued. "Every asset has been identified, every shell company dismantled, every hidden account emptied." Through the reinforced windows, weak winter sunlight cast harsh shadows across the visiting room. Other prisoners met with family members, but Daniel sat alone with his lawyer, the only visitor he'd had in months. "Judge Washington's restitution plan is proceeding exactly as she designed," the lawyer said, shuffling more papers. "The victims are receiving monthly payments. Some have even managed to rebuild their lives." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he signed where indicated. Each signature felt like another nail in his coffin, another piece of his former life stripped away. "There's more," the lawyer added, almost apologetically. "They're releasing a documentary about the case next month. The Price of Power." Judge Washington gave an interview about the importance of corporate accountability. Daniel's jaw tightened at her name. 5 years later, and Judge Alexandria Washington still haunted him. She'd presided over every appeal, methodically dismantling each desperate legal challenge. Her reputation had soared while his name became synonymous with corruption. "The Harvard Business Review is using your case as a teaching example," the lawyer continued. "How unchecked power corrupts, how justice eventually prevails. Your stories become required reading in ethics classes." A bitter laugh escaped Daniel's throat. "Ethics? I own those professors. Bought their silence with donations and consulting fees. Not anymore." The lawyer pushed another document forward. "Harvard's established a whistleblower scholarship with the money they recovered from you. They're naming it after one of your victims." Outside the prison walls, Daniel's impact on the world was being systematically erased. His name removed from buildings, his donations returned or redirected to victims' funds, his business practices used as warnings in textbooks. "Your children have legally changed their names," the lawyer added quietly. "They don't want any connection to the Remington legacy." Daniel stared at his hands, once manicured and adorned with expensive rings, now rough from prison work detail. "What's left, after all the seizures and fines?" "Nothing." The lawyer's tone held no satisfaction, just tired finality. "Judge Washington's restitution plan captured everything. Your personal accounts, business holdings, properties, investments, artwork, even your watches and cufflinks, it's all gone." The visiting room seemed to shrink around them. Daniel remembered standing in his penthouse, surveying Manhattan like a king. Now his whole world consisted of concrete walls and metal bars. "The victim support group is thriving," the lawyer continued, almost mechanically now. "They meet monthly in your old corporate headquarters. The building's been converted into a community center, funded by seized Remington assets." Each word drove home the completeness of his fall. Daniel had once commanded an empire. Now he couldn't even control his daily schedule, every hour dictated by prison routine. "Grace Henderson's grandchildren are attending college on scholarships created from your seized funds," the lawyer said. "The money you stole from their grandfather's pension is putting them through school. Judge Washington made sure of that." The afternoon sun cast Judge Washington's courthouse office in warm light as she reviewed case files. 5 years after the Remington verdict, her reputation for integrity had only grown. The silver in her hair gleamed as she studied documents, still working late into the evening. A knock at her door interrupted her concentration. "Come in." Catherine Bennett entered, now a senior prosecutor handling major financial crimes. "You've heard about the documentary?" I did my interview last week, Judge Washington nodded. They wanted to focus on the legal precedents the case established. It's more than precedents, Catherine said, taking a seat. The Remington case changed how we prosecute corporate crime. His conviction showed that no one is too powerful for justice. Judge Washington set down her pen, considering. He believed money equaled power, that wealth put him above the law, that a black woman could never stand against him. He wasn't the only one who thought that. Catherine smiled slightly. Remember how many people said you should recuse yourself? That you were too personally invested to be impartial? Because obviously a black female judge couldn't be objective about a wealthy white man. Judge Washington's tone held dry humor. Funny how they never worried about white male judges being biased. Outside her window, the Manhattan skyline glittered in the gathering dusk. Somewhere in that maze of lights, hundreds of Remington's victims were rebuilding their lives, supported by the very wealth he'd stolen from them. The restitution program is working better than we hoped, Catherine reported. 98% of victims have received initial payments. Many have gotten job training, counseling, fresh starts. Good. Judge Washington's satisfaction was quiet, but genuine. The money means nothing without healing, without justice. Back in the prison visiting room, Daniel's lawyer gathered the signed documents. One last thing. Judge Washington asked me to give you a message. Daniel's head snapped up. After 5 years, any word from her still held power over him. She said to tell you that true justice isn't about punishment. It's about restoration, about making things right. The lawyer paused. She said that's why. Every dollar you stole is being used to heal the damage you caused. Through the prison windows, Daniel could see the sun setting behind clouds heavy with snow. Another night approached, one of thousands stretching ahead of him. In her courthouse office, Judge Washington finished her day's work. She stood at her window, watching the city lights emerge like stars. 5 years ago, she'd faced down a man who thought his money made him untouchable. She'd shown him, and the world, what real power looked like. Her phone buzzed. Another journalist requesting an interview about the Remington case. She declined politely. This wasn't about her. It was about justice, about accountability, about showing that no one was above the law. The prison lights dimmed, signaling evening lockdown. Daniel shuffled back to his cell, each step echoing off concrete walls. His lawyer's words followed him. True justice isn't about punishment. He'd never understood that, never grasped that real power came from integrity, not intimidation, from justice, not corruption, from serving the law, not believing yourself above it. Now he had decades left to contemplate that lesson. In the darkness of his cell, Daniel remembered his first day in court, how he'd smirked at Judge Washington, refused to stand, treated her with contempt. He hadn't recognized real authority when it sat before him. The night deepened. Somewhere in Manhattan, Judge Washington's office light finally went dark. She'd spend tomorrow like every other day, ensuring justice was served, not through force or fear, but through unwavering integrity. Daniel lay on his narrow bunk, staring at shadows on his cell wall. His empire was gone. His name was mud. His legacy was destruction, and the black woman he dismissed as beneath him had become a symbol of justice's triumph over corruption. Morning brought more evidence of his erasure from the world. The business magazines that once featured him now used his story as a cautionary tale. The politicians who'd taken his money now championed corporate accountability. The society that had celebrated him now pretended they'd never known him. In the prison yard, other inmates ignored him. He was no longer Daniel Remington, titan of industry. He was just another old man in prison denim, shuffling through his days, waiting to die. Judge Washington's courtroom remained as busy as ever. Other corrupt executives, other financial criminals, other powerful men who thought themselves above the law, all learned the same lesson Daniel had. That true authority didn't come from wealth or intimidation. It came from integrity. The documentary, aired to critical acclaim. Viewers watched Daniel's fall from power, saw justice methodically dismantling his empire. But the real star was Judge Washington, calmly ensuring that right prevailed over might. Daniel refused to watch it. But in his cell at night, he imagined the scenes. His arrogance in court, his attacks on witnesses, his rage as Judge Washington systematically exposed his crimes, his final understanding that all his money, all his power, all his corruption couldn't stand against simple integrity. Years stretched ahead of him, decades of prison routine, of visiting room meetings, of watching his name fade from memory. His children wouldn't visit. His friends had abandoned him. His empire was dust. But somewhere in Manhattan, Judge Alexandria Washington continued her work. Not for fame or power or wealth. For justice. For integrity. For the simple truth that no one was above the law. Daniel turned away from his cell window, away from the distant city lights. In the end, he'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that real power looked nothing like what he'd spent his life pursuing. It looked like Judge Washington, quietly ensuring that justice prevailed. The night stretched endless before him, one of thousands yet to come. In the darkness, Daniel Remington, once master of a financial empire, now just another prisoner serving a century-long sentence, finally understood what true authority meant. It hadn't meant anything he'd ever possessed. Outside his prison walls, Manhattan's lights twinkled like stars. Somewhere in that glittering skyline, Judge Washington's legacy of integrity grew stronger every day. While Daniel's empire of corruption crumbled to nothing, her quiet authority reshaped the very system he'd tried to corrupt. Justice, it turned out, didn't need threats or bribes or intimidation. It just needed unwavering integrity. And in the end, that had been more than enough to bring down the mighty Daniel Remington. What would you do if you faced someone like Daniel Remington? Someone who thought their money made them above the law. If this story of justice served kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales of power, corruption, and the people brave enough to fight back. Leave a comment below with what you think happened to Daniel's hidden millions. Some say they're still out there, waiting to be found. New stories of justice and redemption drop every day. Ring that bell so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't money or influence. Sometimes it's simply the unshakable force of justice.